I returned to Russia in November 1914, at the beginning of the First World War, after a long journey through Egypt, Ceylon, and India. When leaving St. Petersburg, I had said that I was going to seek the miraculous. The miraculous is very difficult to define. For me, this word had a quite definite meaning. I had come to the conclusion a long time ago that there was no escape from the labyrinth of contradictions in which we live, except by an entirely new road, unlike anything hitherto known or used by us. I was unable to say where this new or forgotten road began. I already knew then, as an undoubted fact, that beyond the thin film of false reality there existed another reality from which, for some reason, something separated us. The miraculous was a penetration into this unknown reality. When I went away, I already knew I was going to look for a school or schools. I had arrived at this long ago. I realized that individual efforts were insufficient, and it was necessary to come into touch with the real and living thought which must be in existence somewhere, but with which we had lost contact. I could not explain it clearly, but it seemed to me that even the beginning of contact with the school may have a miraculous nature. I imagined, for example, the possibility of making contact with schools of the distant past, with schools of Pythagoras, with schools of Egypt, with the schools of those who built Notre Dame, and so on. It seemed to me that the barriers of time and space should disappear on making such a contact. Soon after my return to St. Petersburg in February and March 1915, I gave public lectures on my travels in India. The titles of the lectures were In Search of the Miraculous. I felt that on the basis of a search, it would be possible to unite together a large number of people who were no longer able to swallow the customary forms of lying and living in lying. Later, I went to Moscow and started with editorial work in the newspaper for which I had written from India. Among people whom I met were two, one a musician and the other a sculptor, who very soon began to speak to me about a group in Moscow which was engaged in various occult investigations and experiments and directed by a certain Gurdjieff, a Caucasian Greek. Because of my previous experience, it was only after the persistent efforts of one of my new acquaintances that I agreed to meet Gurdjieff and have a talk with him. My first meeting with him entirely changed my opinion of him and of what I might expect from him. I remember this meeting very well. I saw a man who astonished me because he seemed completely out of the place and its atmosphere. I was still full of impressions of the East, and this man with the face of an Indian Raja or an Arab sheikh, whom I at once seemed to see in a white burnous or a gilded turban, was sitting in that small cafe. He spoke Russian incorrectly with a strong Caucasian accent, and this accent, with which we are accustomed to associate anything apart from philosophical ideas, strengthened still further the strangeness and the unexpectedness of this impression. I was deeply interested in everything he said. I felt in it some new points of view, unlike any I had met with before. He invited me to go with him to a house where some of his pupils were gathering. On the way, he told me how the war had interfered with many of his plans. Many of his pupils had gone with the first mobilization. Once or twice, he mentioned his journeys in the East and the existence of the ancient knowledge. I could not make out exactly where he had been. I mentioned to him my intention of going to the East again. Even if you found schools, you would find only philosophical schools, he said. There are only philosophical schools in India. It was divided up in that way long ago. In India there was philosophy, in Egypt theory, and in present-day Persia, Mesopotamia, and Turkestan practice. But you do not understand clearly what I mean by philosophy, theory, and practice. These words must be understood in a different way, not as they are usually understood. But how did you study? I asked him. I was not alone. There were all kinds of specialists among us. Everyone studied on the lines of his particular subject. Afterwards, when we got together, we put together everything we had found. And where are your companions now? Some have died, some are working, some have gone into seclusion. This word from the monastic language, heard so unexpectedly, gave me a strange and uncomfortable feeling. One was struck by a great inner simplicity and naturalness in him, which made one completely forget that he was, for us, the representative of the world of the miraculous and the unknown. Though he did not say it loudly, he gave me to understand that he would accept me as one of his pupils if I expressed the wish. If ancient knowledge has been preserved, and if, speaking in general, there exists a knowledge distinct from our science and philosophy, or even surpassing it, why is it so carefully concealed? Why is it not made common property? Why are the men who possess this knowledge unwilling to let it pass into general circulation of life, for the sake of a better and more successful struggle against deceit, evil, and ignorance? He answered, the crowd neither wants nor seeks knowledge, and the leaders of the crowd, in their own interests, try to strengthen its fear and dislike of anything new and unknown. The slavery in which mankind lives is based upon this fear. It is even difficult to imagine all the horror of this slavery. We do not understand what people are loosing. To understand the cause of this slavery, it is enough to see how people live. What makes the aim of their existence, the object of their desires, passions, and aspirations, of what they think, of what they talk, what they serve, and what they worship. I remembered that a few days before this talk, I had seen two enormous lorries loaded to the height of the first floor of the houses with new unpainted wooden crutches. For some reason, I was very much struck by these lorries. In these mountains of crutches, for legs which were not yet cut off, was a particularly cynical mockery of all the things with which people deceive themselves. "What do you expect?" said Gurdjieff. "People are machines. Machines have to be blind and unconscious. They cannot be otherwise, and all their actions have to correspond to their nature. Everything happens. No one does anything. Progress and civilization, in the real meaning of these words, can appear only as a result of conscious efforts. They do not appear as a result of unconscious mechanical actions. And what conscious effort can there be in machines? And if one machine is unconscious, then 100 machines are unconscious, and so are 1,000 machines, or 100,000, or 1,000,000. And the unconscious activity of 1,000,000 machines must necessarily result in destruction and extermination. It is precisely in unconscious, involuntary manifestations that all evil lies. You do not understand yet and cannot imagine all the results of this evil, but the time will come when you will understand. Talks with Gurdjieff and the unexpected turn he gave to every idea interested me more and more every day. But I had to go to St. Petersburg. I remember my last talk with him. I had thanked him for the consideration he had given me and for explanations which obviously had changed many things for me. But all the same, you know, the most important thing is facts, I said. If I could see genuine and real facts of a new and unknown character, only they would finally convince me that I am on the right way. I was again thinking of miracles. There will be facts, said Gurdjieff, I promise you, but many other things are necessary first. I did not understand his last words then. I only understood them later when I really came up against facts, for Gurdjieff kept his word. But this was not until about a year and a half later, in August 1916. I thought about that in the night train on the way from Moscow to St. Petersburg. I asked myself whether I had indeed found what I was looking for. Was it possible that Gurdjieff actually knew what had to be done in order to proceed from words or ideas to deeds and facts? I was still not certain of anything, nor could I formulate anything precisely, but I had an inner conviction that something had already changed for me and that now everything would go differently. This was the terrible summer of 1915, with its gradually lowering atmosphere from which, in spite of all efforts, I could not free myself. One day, it was already autumn, Gurdjieff telephoned me. He had come to St. Petersburg for a few days. I went to see him at once, and in between conversation with other people who came to see him on various matters, he spoke to me just as he had in Moscow. After January 1916, he began to visit St. Petersburg regularly every fortnight, sometimes with some of his pupils from Moscow. From among those who came to our lectures, a small group of people was gradually formed who did not miss a single opportunity of listening to Gurdjieff and who met together in his absence. This was the beginning of the first St. Petersburg group. The war was now being waged on Russian territory and was coming nearer to us. We all felt that we had to hurry, that we were doing too little compared with the immensity of the task we had set ourselves. We realized that our chance of knowing more might go just as suddenly as it had come, and we tried to increase the pressure of work on ourselves and to do all that we could while the conditions were favorable. The next lecture began with the words, "Know thyself." These words, said Gurdjieff, which are generally ascribed to Socrates, actually lie at the basis of many systems and schools far more ancient than the Socratic. The modern man of our times, even a man with philosophic or scientific interests, does not realize that the principle, "Know thyself," speaks of the necessity of knowing one's machine, the human machine. A man does not know himself. A man is a very complex machine, much more complicated than a locomotive, a motor car, or an aeroplane. People know nothing, or next to nothing, about the structure, the working, and the possibilities of the machine. They do not understand the simplest functions, for they do not know the aims of these functions. They vaguely imagine how they should learn to control the machine, the way they control a locomotive, a motor car, or an aeroplane. If you are not educated to control a human machine, it is as much dangerous as when dealing with other complicated machines. But it is clear to everyone when planes, cars, or locomotives are in question. But they rarely think of that when considering people generally or individually. I was already beginning to think that the catastrophe would be upon us before I succeeded in doing what I intended. My thoughts very often returned to the Moscow talks. Several times when things became particularly difficult, I said to myself, I will give up everything and go to Gurdjieff in Moscow. And at this thought, I always felt easier. I often recalled my first meeting with Gurdjieff and that night spent with the group in Moscow. Then I was prepared to give the final judgment of Gurdjieff and his pupils. But something had stopped me. Now that I realize how important these ideas are, I became almost terrified at the thought of how easily I could have known nothing whatever of Gurdjieff's existence, how I could have again lost sight of him if I had not asked then whether I could see him again. Among the talks of this period, Gurdjieff several times touched upon the question of religion. What particularly astonished me in Gurdjieff's explanations was the extent to which so much has been preserved in its pure form, and how little we understand of all this. His explanations differed very much from the usual theological and even from mystical interpretations. Christianity forbids murder, yet all that the whole of our progress comes to is progress in the technique of murder and progress in warfare. It became obvious from his explanations that we take many things for allegories in which there is no allegory whatever, and which ought to be understood much more simply. What he said before about the Last Supper serves as a good example of this. Every ceremony or rite has a value if it is performed without alteration, he said. A ceremony is a book in which a great deal is written. Anyone who understands can read it. One rite often contains more than 100 books. For instance, in all the denominations of Christianity, a great part is played by the tradition of the Last Supper of Christ and his disciples. To understand what took place at the Last Supper, it is first of all necessary to know certain laws. Christ knew that he must die. It had been decided thus beforehand. He knew it, and so did his disciples. And each one knew what part he had to play. But at the same time, they wanted to establish a permanent link with Christ. And for this purpose, he gave them his blood to drink and his flesh to eat. The Last Supper was a magical ceremony, similar to blood brotherhood, for establishing a connection between astral bodies. But who is there who knows about this in existing religions and who understands what it means? All this has been long forgotten, and everything has been given quite a different meaning. The words have remained, but their meaning has been long lost. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in Russia was growing gloomier. One felt that something was bound to happen, and that very soon. During Gurdjieff's last visit, I tried to speak to him about coming events, but he said nothing definite on which I could base my own actions. During the past 2 years, I had given up all my time to his work, to his groups, to talks connected with his work, to journeys from St. Petersburg, and had completely neglected my own affairs. All my plans had long since been upset. Finally, the great bloodless revolution took place. That was the most absurd and blatant lie that could have been thought of. But the most extraordinary thing of all was that people who were there on the spot, in the center of everything that was happening, could believe in this lie. And in the midst of all the murders could speak about a bloodless revolution. I was surprised by our intelligentsia, who from patriots immediately became revolutionaries and socialists. Even the Novoye Vremya suddenly became a socialist paper. And for the people, the word Tsar had lost all significance. The word still had a great significance for the army and the bureaucratic machine, but the abdication of the Tsar was bound to destroy the whole machine. Russia was in turmoil. After Gurdjieff's departure, up to the time of the revolution, we only got news of him from Moscow once or twice. It was a week after the revolution that I collected the principal members of our group and put before them my views on the situation. I said that, in my opinion, there was no sense in staying in Russia anymore, and that we had to go abroad. Soon after the meeting, I received a postcard from Gurdjieff, written a month before in the train on the way from Moscow to the Caucasus, which had been lying all the time at the post office because of prevailing disorders. It was evident from the postcard that he had left Moscow before the revolution and knew nothing of the events. Meanwhile, time was passing. It was already early in June when I received a telegram from Gurdjieff asking me to come to Alexandropol. In 2 days, I left St. Petersburg. Russia, with no authorities, presented a very curious spectacle. I was traveling for 5 days to Tiflis instead of the normal 3. The whole station was crammed with soldiers. Many of them were drunk. There were some courts-martial, and 3 men were shot there on the platform. A drunken comrade explained that the first man had been shot for theft, the second was shot by mistake because he was mistaken for the first, and the third was also shot by mistake because he had been mistaken for the second. I had to stay the day in Tiflis. The train to Alexandropol went in the evening only. The following morning, I was there. I found Gurdjieff setting a dynamo for his brother. Again, I noticed his remarkable capacity for adapting himself to any kind of work. I met his family. They were people of a very old and peculiar culture. His father was a narrator of legends and traditions, something of a bard. I spent about 2 weeks in Alexandropol. One fine day, Gurdjieff said that I would be going to St. Petersburg. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, I had to inform the members of the group that he was beginning new work in Kislovodsk. The papers which I got on the way were full of news about shooting in the streets of St. Petersburg. Those were the Bolsheviks who were shooting into the crowd. They were trying their strength. In Moscow, I managed to see a few people while waiting for the night train to St. Petersburg, and I passed on to them what Gurdjieff had said. Then I went to St. Petersburg and passed on the message to our groups. In 12 days, I was again on the train to the Caucasus. In Pyatigorsk, I learned that Gurdjieff was not living at Kislovodsk, but at Essentuki, and in 2 hours' time I was with him in a small country villa. We spent 6 weeks in Essentuki. Even 6 years would be a short period for everything that was connected with this time, to such an extent was it filled. During those 6 weeks, Gurdjieff unfolded to us the plan of the whole work. He led us at a fast pace without losing a single minute. We went to bed very late and got up very early. We slept for 4 or 5 hours at the most. We did all the housework, and the rest of the time was occupied with exercises. All the ideas we had come to know up to that time brought us face to face with a whole series of questions connected with the practical realization of work on oneself. In life, everything is always arranged far too comfortably for a man to work. In a school, a man finds himself among other people who were not his choice and with whom perhaps it is difficult to live and work. The short Essentuki summer was drawing to a close. We had begun to think of the winter and to make various plans. and suddenly everything changed, for a reason that seemed to be accidental and which was the result of friction between certain members of our group. Gurdjieff announced that he was dispersing the whole group and stopping all work. At first we simply did not believe him, thinking he was putting us to a test. All of us announced that we would follow him wherever he went. Gurdjieff consented to this, but he said that we had to look after ourselves and that there would not be any work, no matter how much we counted on it. All this surprised me very much. I considered the moment most inappropriate for acting, and if Gurdjieff was serious, then why had the whole business been started? I don't know why, but from this moment there began in me the separation between Gurdjieff and his ideas. Until then I had not separated them. My personal position in Gurdjieff's work began to change. For a whole year something had been accumulating, and gradually I began to see that there were many things I could not understand, and that I had to go. The decision to leave Gurdjieff's work and leave him produced in me a great inner struggle. Later I found the possibility to continue to work in the same direction as Gurdjieff, but independently. Soon afterwards I managed to leave for Constantinople. At that time Constantinople was full of Russians. I met acquaintances from St. Petersburg, and with their assistance I began to give lectures. I got no letters from Gurdjieff, but I was sure he would come to Constantinople. He actually arrived in June with a fairly large company. I was very glad to see Gurdjieff, and to me personally it seemed then that, in the interests of the work, all former difficulties should be set aside, and that I could work with him as in St. Petersburg. I brought Gurdjieff to my lectures and handed over to him all the people who came to my lectures, particularly the small group of about 30 people that I worked most with. Everything was very interesting for me. Gurdjieff often came to see me. We went together through the Constantinople bazaars. We went to the Mehlevi dervishes, and he explained something to me that I had not been able to understand before. And this was that the whirling of the Mehlevi dervishes was an exercise for the brain based upon counting, like those exercises that he showed to us in Essentuki. In August 1921, I went to London, where I gave lectures in continuation of the work in Constantinople. In February 1922, Gurdjieff came to London. I introduced him to all who were coming to my lectures. This time my attitude towards him was much more definite. I did not believe it was possible for me to work with him. I saw again all the obstacles which had begun to appear in Essentuki. This time they had appeared even before he arrived. I decided that if Gurdjieff opened the institute in London, I would go either to Paris or to America. The institute was opened in London, but for various reasons it failed. My London friends and those who came to my lectures collected a considerable sum of money for him, and with this Gurdjieff bought the historic Chateaubriand near Paris. There he opened his institute. A very interesting and animated work was proceeding there. A lot of new and interesting things. Dances of dervishes and the music were held for the first time in Europe. Everyone was impressed who had the opportunity to see and hear that. I arrived at the Chateaubriand for the first time at the end of October or the beginning of November 1922. I remember one talk with Miss Catherine Mansfield, who was then living there. She already seemed to me to be halfway to death, and I thought that she was fully aware of that. But with all this, one was struck by the striving in her to make the best use, even of those last days, to find the truth whose presence she clearly felt, but which she was unable to touch. She spoke in a feeble voice which seemed to come from the void, but it was not unpleasant. I know that this is true, and that there is no other truth. You know that I have long since looked upon all of us, without exception, as people who have suffered shipwreck and have been cast upon an uninhabited island, but who do not yet know it. But these people here know it. The others, there in life, still think that a steamer will come for them tomorrow and that everything will go on in the old way. These already know that there will be no more of the old way. I am so glad that I can be here.